good afternoon, and welcome to the Bible Study Studio. Today, our reading found us in the book of Exodus. After today, we are a third of the way through the book of Exodus. Isn't that exciting? So, Exodus 1:1 through Exodus 15 is our reading for today. And tomorrow, our reading is Exodus 15:19 through Exodus 28:43. And there are 40 chapters in the book of Exodus. Now, I did write in my journal. I wrote in my 90 days through the word journal. And I also wrote in my trusty notebook, my trusty composition book, because there was a lot. There's a lot going on in the book of Exodus today. So, at the end of the book of Genesis, we're in the understanding that Joseph has passed away, Jacob has passed away. Now, by the time we get to the book of Exodus, of course, Jacob has passed away and Joseph has passed away, and all of the first generation, all of Joseph's generation of siblings have passed away. And they started out being 70 persons in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they ended up multiplying greatly to the point that the new Pharaoh, the new king, was fearful of the children of Israel. He was very, very fearful of the children of Israel. So that is where the text brings us to today. Pharaoh, the new king of Egypt, is fearful of the growth and prosperity of, well, not prosperity because they're enslaved. They're enslaved because remember, at the end of the book of Genesis, the famine, everybody had to sell everything, and then they sold themselves into slavery because of the famine. So that's where we are. That is where we are. And the Egyptians, the Pharaoh and the Egyptians, made life hard for the Hebrew children. They made life very, very hard and difficult for the Hebrew children, to the point that they asked the midwives to get rid of the sons that were born in labor. They asked the midwives to get rid of the sons that were born in labor. But the midwives did not follow the instructions, and they ended up getting in trouble with Pharaoh. But because of the midwives' inaction, Pharaoh instituted a policy which said all male Hebrew children had to be thrown in the Nile River. All male Hebrew children had to be thrown in the Nile River. So, enter the scene, Moses. So this is how we get to Moses, because Moses is a male child that is born as a Hebrew, and his mother does not just throw him in the Nile River. She places him in a basket and puts him in the Nile River. And while close to the Nile River, Pharaoh's daughter discovers the baby boy, decides she wants to keep him, but because he's not her child, she gets a nurse for him, which just happens to be Pharaoh's mother. Which just happens to be Moses' mother. So, Moses is saved from death in the Nile River because his mother put him in a basket. Pharaoh's daughter found him, determined that she wanted to keep him, But since she was not of nursing age or ability, she hired a nurse to nurse him, who was actually his mother. But after he was weaned, he was returned to Pharaoh's daughter, and she reared him as her son, which meant that this Hebrew boy, Moses, was reared in Pharaoh's house as an Egyptian. So he's not an Egyptian, he's Hebrew, but he's reared in the household of Pharaoh. So when he gets grown and old enough, he goes out and he's out and about, and he sees that some of his folks are being mistreated, and he kills an Egyptian. He kills an Egyptian. And he thinks that nobody sees. But the truth of the matter is, someone saw, someone knew, and the next day he realized that that was what had happened. And so he quickly escaped to a land called Midian. And there he finds a wife. He gets married and he finds a wife. And I'm looking at the time because it looks like I'm talking slow today. So in Midian, Moses finds a wife. He gets married. He has children. And some time passed. His father-in-law's name is Jethro. And some time passed. And the Lord, he's out and about one day. And the Lord called to Moses at the burning bush. Here comes our burning bush episode in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, the burning bush, in which the Lord directs Moses to go back to Egypt to save his people, to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. So now we're in chapter 4. Okay, so we go through all of the drama with Moses and the Lord speaking and talking, and Moses not really wanting to take his assignment, but he ultimately does. And the Lord ultimately provides Aaron, his brother, who's in Egypt, to help him with this assignment. And the Lord provides the staff, which he will use as a tool when he stands before Pharaoh. So that is what happens in chapter 4. Aaron becomes his mouthpiece. They had to start to talk to Pharaoh about letting the people go, letting the Hebrew people go. But, of course, we all know there's plague after plague, and Pharaoh, the Lord continuously hardens Pharaoh's heart, and he does not, even throughout all the plagues, he is reluctant. He does not let the people go until the death of his very own son in the final plague of the firstborn of all the households and the firstborn of every beast and animal in the land. And then it's after this that Pharaoh's like, y'all can go. I'm going to see y'all gone. I'm going to see y'all gone. Because, of course, his heart is crushed when he loses his very own son. So, I am looking at all of the plagues in the first part of the book of Exodus. Chapter 10, of course, is the plague of locusts. And then chapter 12, of course, is where the firstborn of all the beasts that plague is done. So we have Passover. We're in chapter 13, and the folks are beginning to leave Egypt, and the Lord promises earlier in Exodus that the Hebrew people would be able to pull plunder from the Egyptian household. And this does happen on their way out the door during Passover. They are able to plunder the households of the Egyptians for all they need and or want. So this was a promise at the beginning of the book of Exodus, and this promise was fulfilled by the Lord to the Hebrew people on their way to the Red Sea. Now we know at the Red Sea, the Hebrew folks are grunting and groaning because they're like, you should have just left us back there. Like, we're not going to survive. This is when Pharaoh changes his mind and decides that he wants the slaves back. Well, I hope that we all know that the Lord God Almighty himself divided the Red Sea in so that the Hebrew children could make way through and escape from Pharaoh and his army. And the Red Sea covered all of the chariots and all of the army of all of Pharaoh's army was lost in the midst of the Red Sea. So, that's Pharaoh in pursuit. And so, when they get to a place of safety, they sing a song. They sing the song of Moses and Israel, and that is a good portion of chapter 15 after the sea is divided and they walk through on dry land. God is so good. God is so good. And it is wonderful to know that we serve the very same God today. We serve the very same God today. I did want to mention in chapter 12 that it was 600,000 men. 600,000 men. And let me see if I have any other notes that I might want to mention. Yes, the Hebrew children were disgruntled, and in 14:15 the Lord asked them to stop crying and move forward. There was something I wanted to read. Oh, chapter 14 verse 24. Yes, 14 verse 24. I have never noticed this before, but it is such a statement. At the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. The Lord just looked. All he did was look. And he brought the army into confusion with a look. This is how good and how powerful and almighty the Lord God is. With a look. I'm going to read it one more time. Exodus 14:24. At the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of Egyptians into confusion. 25. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." He's all powerful. He's almighty. He's all sustaining. And one of the reasons why we're reading through the word in 90 days is so we can remember who the Lord is. We can remember exactly who the Lord is because his greatness and his strength and his might is all through this text that he has provided for us. This is Sonny McCullough-Locker signing out for the Bible Study Studio. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow when we have a reading review of Exodus 15:19 through Exodus 28:43. At that point, we'll be halfway through the book of Exodus and on our way to Leviticus. And we're going to handle Leviticus. We are going to handle Leviticus. Thank you and have a blessed day in the Lord.